my own world was upside down, and then the actual world was upside down with the advent of the pandemic. And the confluence of events was just astronomically challenging. Some people know when their relationship is going to end or you're on the rocks. I didn't know it. It really felt like being hit by a 2x4, or by like these tsunami waves over and over again. The more that I learned about what was happening, and I was so confused and so shocked for the longest time. Like how could this person that I entrusted almost my entire adult life with, we had met in college, we were together until our mid-30s, suddenly be different, suddenly become a person I didn't know at all, and so quickly just leave and file for divorce. It was completely shocking. And then as I found out, there was betrayal and lies, and it just turned my world upside down.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Flip That Shit. I am your host, Stacey Uhrig, and today's guest is going to be Rachel Lipton. Before I interview Rachel, for people that are new to the podcast, let me just give you a quick primer as to what the purpose of this cast is. So I'm a trauma recovery coach, and one of the things that I believe is that many of us, not all of us, but many of us were raised with this idea of life should be good. And anything outside of good, we don't want to talk about, right? So when we're growing up, if something difficult's happening in the household, many of us were indoctrinated with this idea of don't tell anybody, let's not air our dirty laundry. And it teaches us, it kind of, subconsciously, it teaches us that life is only supposed to be good. And when challenges come our way, somehow that's bad and we should avoid it and we should have shame about it and we should keep it in secret. But that's not life. Life is a series of experiences divinely designed for you. And they're here and they're here and they're up and they're down and they just are. They're not good or bad. But too many of us have learned not to share our struggles. And so what happens? We become anxious. We become depressed. We sit in what I call the shadow of shame and feel very isolated. And we wonder why we have so much disconnection right now in our culture. So what I love to do with this podcast is grab people I don't really know well, knowing this, we all have a story. We've all had hard experiences. We've all experienced adversity. And I love to grab these random people that I've only met for maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes prior, find out what their particular story is, talk about that pain, talk about how they got through it, what were their tips and tricks, and then what did you learn from that experience? Because remember, these are series of experiences divinely designed for you. There's purpose in the pain. There's a gift in the challenge. My hope is that if one guest can walk away from today saying, that reminds me of my story, and I haven't shared it with anybody yet, you want to share it with someone, either with Rachel, you can reach Rachel, or with someone that you know and trust, just to get out of that shadow. That's the goal, right? We're trying to get more and more people to connect in struggles. So let me tell you a little bit about Rachel Lipton. Rachel's a certified professional coach. She's also a yoga instructor, and she has a master's in public policy. She partners with executives, emerging leaders, and teams to lead from a place of confidence and strength for greater results. Her coaching practice includes individual and organizational clients who want to find their voice, summon their courage to make big changes, and move to the beat of their own inner wisdom. She specializes in mission-driven organizations and women in the workplace. She offers one-to-one yoga and mindful leadership sessions, leadership and onboarding coaching, group and team coaching, and facilitation of workshops and retreats. But here's what I know about Rachel. She didn't start there. And so what I want to do is kind of just introduce you guys to Rachel, open the floor to her, and have her share with you how she got from where she was to where she is now. So hi, Rachel. How are you?
Good. Hi, Stacey. Thanks so much for having me.
It's so nice to have you. So you and I spoke just a little bit, a few months ago, actually. And you shared with me a really challenging experience you went through. And I was wondering if you could share it with our audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really love what you said about challenges can be a gift and to see the gift in it. And sometimes it takes some distance to see that gift, right? But when I was going
Often
through
takes
it, it didn't feel like a gift.
Right.
So yeah, so I mean, as many of us did during the last 3 years, I went through some really big life changes in the midst of the pandemic, and actually even just leading up to the pandemic. So, sort of the brief history of my story is that. Right a few months prior to the pandemic, my best friend, my husband at the time, my life partner, suddenly decided to leave the marriage. And then a pandemic hit a few months later. And it was the most challenging time of my life. It was, my own world was upside down, and then the actual world was upside down with the advent of the pandemic. And the confluence of events was just astronomically challenging. And it was also the unexpectedness of it, I think, was extra challenging. I think some people know when their relationship is going to end or you're on the rocks. I didn't know it. And so it really felt like being hit by like a 2x4, by like these tsunami waves over and over again, with the more that I learned about what was happening. And I was so confused and so shocked for the longest time. Like how could this person that I entrusted almost my entire adult life with, we had met in college. We were together until our mid 30s. Suddenly be different, suddenly become a person I didn't know at all. And so quickly just leave and file for divorce. It was completely shocking. And then as I found out, there was betrayal and lies, and it was, it just turned my world upside down. And so, and then going through the pandemic, it was like a crash course in truly being by yourself and truly unpacking some really serious emotions and I really experienced so much in the body. And so I really feel like I understood that level of grief in a whole different way. I was telling a group of women when my husband first left that it felt like, I suddenly joined the world of like, oh, now I know what deep suffering and deep grief really feels like. This was like a big event in my life where I hadn't experienced that in such a way before. And knowing that most people, if not everyone, experiences something like that in their lives. And so it almost felt like I was joining this club of humanity.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I'm writing down all these things as you're talking. The first thing I wrote down was loss on top of loss.
Yeah.
You know, you had this like deep loss of your marriage and your partnership. And then all of a sudden with COVID, I think one of the traumas of COVID for so many people was the grief and the loss of freedom, you know, on a lot of levels, right? So here you're doing with loss on top of loss, you're doing loss and isolation. You know, we're talking about this shadow of shame and this isolation and how damaging it can be for people. For women, I think in particular, when we're going through extreme loss, extreme pain, our innate reaction is to connect, go, talk, sit with someone. And now we're physically, you could pick up a phone, you could maybe Zoom somebody, but you cannot physically be close to anyone.
Yes.
Right? You talked about being confused, being shocked. One of the questions I wrote down was, I can't imagine, you know, the words that come to me are confuddled, but also total mindfuck, right? And the self-doubt of like, how did I not see that coming?
Right.
So how did you deal with that? Because I've known other women And I don't know if this was the case for you, but very often when I'm coaching women that are coming out of, say, a narcissistically abusive relationship, which can be very manipulative and very coercive, and there's a lot of love bombing at the beginning, and there's two lives happening that many people don't know about. When they turn around and they look at the wreckage in the wake, they're like, how can I even trust myself anymore? Like, I totally put all my trust in this person.
Mm-hmm.
Did you experience any of that?
Yes, absolutely. It was like, as a coach who was raised by a therapist, I consider myself someone who's pretty aware of people and insightful. So when something like this happens, and it was a shock to my family as well, it was super eye-opening. And as I learned more about narcissistic abuse, I realized that that is what had happened in that moment, and the narrative that he held was almost like a victim narrative, even though he was the one creating that scenario.
Listen, for people that don't know anything about narcissistic abuse, I do a lot of podcasts on narcissistic abuse, and we'll put all the links to all of those episodes in the show notes. But believe me when I tell you, there's a fucking playbook that does not exist that every single one of these people follows. It's like the craziest thing I've ever seen. And the one piece of the playbook that's very, very, very consistent is, woe is me, I'm the victim here. Now, people need to understand what's underneath the hood of narcissism, like real true narcissism, not somebody's just vain, okay? But real true narcissism is an absolute lack of self-esteem and self-worth. So they have to always be seen as the person that's getting the shit end of the stick, right? And they will lie and conflate and build stories that they believe are true, by the way.
100%.
In order to receive the sympathy, because they don't receive anything well. Right? So what's interesting to me in the story is that your mother is also a therapist, you're a coach, and you're right, self-aware. So can you just describe, because it's really, I am on kind of a pseudo mission for people to really understand what narcissism is, because it gets a lot of play. Language-wise, people talk about narcissism. Oh, you're a narc. Oh, it's gaslighting. It's this, that. But it is something really big that people don't understand unless they've been in it. So how would you describe what you didn't know in that relationship that was happening?
Yeah. Well, I just want to reiterate what you said about underneath it as a complete lack of self-worth. I think that there was a lot of shame in him that he never worked through. And I think that shame got manipulated and flipped around so that he could feel worthy, right? And
well, that's where it comes from. And people need to know it starts, this is usually, we talk about psychology, this comes from an attachment style that's just very avoidant or dismissive, right? So that means that the likelihood that a caregiver or caregivers did not meet this person's needs in a way that our needs need to be met when we're very, very young, teaches us to manipulate for attention and attachment.
Yes, 100%. And it's interesting because, and I always told people, like, I had one of the good ones, like he had a degree in feminist studies. And I was so proud that, like, yes, like this is someone who's a little bit different and who doesn't have that like sort of toxic masculinity. But in the end, it was almost like Jekyll and Hyde. It was like two different faces, right? And in some ways, I saw that he had a hard time dealing with stress, and he was kind of on eggshells a lot, and that kind of ethos was present in our relationship, and I kind of accepted it, and we were kind of working through it. But I didn't realize that even deeper sort of insidiousness of that manipulation until this event happened, where it was clear that he wasn't, at first I thought he was literally unaware, like maybe he was having a psychotic break. He didn't fully understand what he was doing. And then through a series of events, I did find out that he knew exactly what he was doing. And it was a premeditated situation, and it involved a lot of lying and a lot of betrayal, and it was extremely confusing to me. And I just kept unveiling more information as it was a very short time. It was really in a matter of 2 months. It was super, super quick. When I looking back, I can see a little bit of how it could have happened. I think he had to take on that caring and nurturing persona in our relationship, but then it almost felt like there was this other side to him that he would get if you push the wrong button or did something that didn't align with what he wanted to do. It was like explosion, right? It was like passive aggressive, so extremely interesting. And then, eventually it was extremely passive aggressive, and it moved to stuffing all the emotions and having panic attacks and ending up in the hospital. And I ended up being the caretaker in that situation. So when I always say to people, hurt people, right? Like when you're
I was just literally thinking that.
Yeah. When you're not completely whole, when you feel wounded and you're not willing to work on it, that's the main thing. Because we all have experiences that are wounding or traumatizing, right? And the people that move forward in life are the people that are willing to do the hard work and investigate and interrogate and change their habits.
Yeah. And you know what's so interesting when I'm thinking when you're saying that? It's like sometimes people don't know why they need to do the work, right? Because when we talk about attachment, and I'm talking about it because it's such a big part of like really what true narcissism is, you're not feeling enough ultimately. So when we talk about trauma, I have a little sign here. It says trauma is never the event. Trauma is the way it's interpreted. So trauma doesn't have to be this big thunderstorm of aggression and abuse and acts of violence. It can simply be, trauma doesn't have to be what happened. It can be what didn't happen. It can simply mean that certain needs were not met from a connection standpoint. And when we're little, like before we're 8 or 10 years old, we process and interpret our surroundings based on how we feel because our rational brain, the part of our rational brain is not developed yet. So we know we don't feel enough. We don't feel seen. We don't feel heard. We don't feel significant or important or valuable to the family unit. And that leads us to create a belief that I'm not deserving of it, or I'm not worthy of it, or I'm not enough. But when we're growing up in households where there are not acts of abuse, aggression, or violence, and the house was calm, but yet maybe our parents were dismissive or not able to connect on their own, right? Because they were limited from their own lived experiences as children into adulthood, right? This is intergenerational trauma apply. We're not going to know we need to do work. Because what am I unveiling? My house was fine. There was no screaming. There was no yelling. Everything was normal, quote unquote. If you're not willing to get aware and say, well, maybe that wasn't normal, that like I was just ignored or I didn't feel important in my household. Right. And those are very often the things that lead to this kind of personality challenge, like I like to call it.
Absolutely. And that resonates to some extent with what happened with my ex. I think it was very apparent he didn't get what he needed from his parents. I do feel like there was also probably some yelling in the house from what I understand, but it was very clear. And what you're describing in terms of, not feeling like enough from your own family, I think then in turn creates this dynamic within yourself where you have to then be the victim so that and it also prevents you from having to make change, right? Like if you're always the victim, you can stay exactly where you are, which is maybe the safer place to be, even though it's a more toxic place to be.
100%. And what I'll lead up with is And I say it all the time, like a broken record. We only need like a handful of things when we're really, really young, really just a handful. Keep me fed, keep me hydrated, keep shelter, like safe shelter over my head, keep me clean. But more importantly than any of it, let me know I belong as I am. We are hardwired for connection. You know, Brene Brown says this all the time. We are hardwired for connection.
Mm-hmm.
And any time that connection feels threatened, you know, or there's conditions, unless you show up, Johnny, in this way, I'm going to be upset with you. You know, if you don't show up perfect and silent and just play the part, but I'm not going to give you anything in return because I can't, because I'm limited, then I'm going to withdraw from you. And that's a big part of it. A lot of these people that come into narcissism as the abuser, if you will, were denied or, you know, kind of punished by the caretaker withholding affection. I'll only give it to you if you show up the right way. Becomes very conditional.
Yeah.
Right.
And that is so hurtful when we don't realize how hurtful that is, right? Because and that core wound, honestly, is so much of what I work with in coaching, even if it's from a leadership standpoint, right? Because
so let's talk about that. Because I was talking to an organizational psychologist the other day. I had my dog in the backyard and she happened to be in my backyard running her dog. And we found out we're in similar spaces. And we were talking about actually how untrauma informed organizations are and how narcissistic actually so many major organizations are.
Yes.
But there's a missing piece because the way these leaders are showing up and leading organizations are based on their own lived experiences and their own attachment as children, right?
100%.
So tell me what you see there. Tell us about what you do and how you got from where you were to this role.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, leadership is so important. And it became very apparent to me when I entered the professional world in the midst of the 2008 economic crisis. And I had a really hard time, not only finding paid work, but also finding work that had really great leaders. I would say in my career, most of the organizations I've worked for, even though I've worked in the social impact sector, primarily with social justice nonprofits, mission-driven organizations, that toxicity exists across sectors, across organizations, right? Because when you bring your hurt self to work, you know, you're not leaving your hurt self behind. And so people, you know, they come with all of their well-worn neuro pathways, right? All their habits and their ways of being. And when they get triggered, which is also really easy to do at work, we spend at least a third of our lives at work, if not more. And we are in often high stress environments and dealing with lots of change. People show up in ways that create toxicity. And I experienced that as a younger professional. It really gave me the drive to want to change that and work with people to really be more aware, really unpack some of the hard stuff, really do more of the inner work. So not just focusing on leadership competencies, which is great, but how do you show up as a person and a leader? Because I often feel like the way that you show up in life is also how you show up as a leader, whether you're the leader of an organization or you're the leader of your own life, right? We are the CEOs of our own life. We make executive decisions all the time. And so the way we show up has a super big effect on people, particularly people who are in the quote unquote, lower on the power structure, right? Like your affect has such ripple effects when you're in a leadership position. And I don't just mean the CEO. I mean, anyone who has some kind of power in an organization. It really affects how the organization functions and the organizational culture. And we had a big awakening really starting in 2020, I think, when we all went to remote work, or many of us went to remote work, those that could. like we kind of looked under the hood a little bit, and then I think we like closed it a little bit now. Like, oh, done. And so there's that, just like an individual, an organization also needs that constant dynamic nurturing and insight and awareness as well. And that's why I also love doing both the leadership and the team coaching, because there's so much impact that can have. And we often focus on the beneficiaries of the work. Like, let's be a trauma-informed organization. But what does that mean for the actual people working in the organization, not just the people that you're serving? So even in organizations where there is this mission-driven social impact work, I noticed that toxicity still abounds, right? It's still the same whether you're at Google or whether you're in, a social justice nonprofit. It's the same kind of things that come up over and over again.
Oh, it's ego, right?
It's yes, ego, narcissism for sure shows up. And interestingly enough, and I feel as you get into leadership positions, it's interesting who gets into leadership positions. And sometimes it's surprising who gets into leadership positions. And
well, they're not necessarily there because they're good leaders, right?
100%. 100%. Or they may be great at having a vision, but they don't
know how to manage and execute.
Exactly. And that has been my experience as well, as an employee in organizations. So now I love working with people to show up better. We talk about both the doing, which is so easy to do in our culture. We like to check things off our list. We like to build that skill. We like to see measurable outcomes. But it's also so much about the being. Like, how do you show up every day? How are you present with what is? And that is so important for life and for work. And if you are a more aware and insightful person, and you know how to use tools to change the ways that aren't serving you or aren't serving other people that you work with, then you're going to be a great leader. And so that's the kind of work that I like, the deep work that I like to do, is really that inner exploration.
So I have so many questions about this. So the first question is how did you use what you knew in order to be the greatest leader of your life amidst that tragic experience?
Great question. Oh my goodness. When you're just like, it was like bottom of, when you're bottom of the barrel, when all of your, when everything feels like it's stripped away, right? When your whole perspective, your whole world feels literally wobbly. I remember I had a coach saying, be careful when you walk during this time, because you're going to feel off balance. And I did. Like, I have never experienced such somatic reactions in my body. I had never experienced the range of and intensity of emotions that I experienced during that time. And part of what I did was, well, first of all, they were so raw. I don't even think I had a choice but to feel them and but to move through them. But oftentimes we like to push emotions away. We like to push, it's uncomfortable, right? You got to push it under the rug. But if you do that, it's going to pop up in other ways, either physically or it's just going to come up again, right? And so I almost felt like I had no choice but to move through it. And I sort of intuitively knew, just from being a movement-oriented person and a yoga teacher and had a practice of yoga, that, by the way, I didn't do any yoga for I could barely even do yoga during that time. It was just
because you were just so tightly wound up.
I was so,
or just because your mind was in such a fog.
It was both. It was not only so tightly wound, I literally felt like a person who had taken drugs. Like, I would get into these states where, like, I felt like I had 1,000-pound chains on my feet and it was so hard to walk. Or I felt like my eyes were like bulging out of my head. There's.
But this is your nervous system on overdrive.
100%.
Right.
So it was just a matter of, do what intuitively feels right to you. So sometimes it was literally just lying on the floor in child's pose. Sometimes it was trying to go for a walk, even though it felt extremely hard. Sometimes it was jumping on my mini trampoline and putting on some Rihanna. And I let myself move through that. And it took me over a year of having that intensity of emotion to start moving through it. And it was an extremely non-linear process. And especially in the midst of the pandemic, there was that hopelessness. It's like, we didn't have, at the beginning, we didn't know when vaccines were coming. We didn't really know anything. And so it was like this feeling of despair and hopelessness because all of my social supports were stripped away. And I was really in it. And I will say I'm a very lucky person in that I have amazing parents, and they ended up becoming my pod and my main support. And that really helped me get through it. My animals, I had two cats, as you can probably see in the background. I have two cats, and now I have two dogs, but at the time I just had two cats. And honestly, the simplest things became so important for me.
Everything.
And one of my best friends told me something that was really helpful. She's like, just go back to basics. Like, consider it a win if you do the dishes. Consider it a win if you feed yourself nourishing food. Consider it a win if you can like focus on like petting your cat, right?
I think this is so important because people expect so much of themselves and they're not willing to give themselves enough grace half the time.
Yes.
Right. And so you're right. It's like, it's a win that you opened your eyes and decided to roll out of bed today.
Yes. Because when things get that hard, your body shuts down and it's hard to do things.
Your amygdala is hijacked, right? And you can't really think, you can't really focus, you can't really do. Your ability to motivate and your dopamine productions in the shitter. So like, it's really hard to just say, I'm going to get up for the sake of getting up right now, especially when you don't have to be anywhere. You're going to roll over to your desk. It's a strange circumstance. You can't get out of your house.
Right. It was a very weird time. It was like one of those things where it was just like the weirdest time to be going through something like that and feel truly alone.
So you learned how to lead within your own system. How do you use that experience to lead better than you were able to before to these leaders and these executive teams?
Yeah. I think when you go through this kind of deep grief, deep trauma, you become a more compassionate person. And you also understand, even if someone has a different experience than you, you understand what it is like to go through that deep grief or deep emotion. And so it actually makes me a better coach. It makes me a more curious and compassionate person in general. I also know what it's like to go through that and then also get to the other side, which I never thought I would get to. When you're in it, you can't see it, right? It's only in hindsight you can look back, and I can see the gift now. I'm so happy I'm not with that person anymore. And actually I never wanted to go back to that person once I discovered who he was underneath.
Right.
But I love my life now. And, I'm continually rebuilding it, right? It's been 3 years, but 3 years isn't that long of a time when you've been with somebody your entire adult life. Right. And so there are pieces of, it's all about finding the gift in that. And I actually feel like I'm more of myself than I ever was, because I don't have that energy of living with a person who has that kind of downward spiral energy. And
so that's what I was going to ask. So there was something you said at the beginning when I was talking about the gift and the challenge, and you said sometimes it's not realized till much later. It's often not realized till much later.
Yeah.
I'm very careful, and I've been saying that phrase for, 5-6 years. I'm very careful because I do, and I am very mindful of people who have lost loved ones, who have gone through severe tragedy that they would never wish on their worst enemy. I'm never saying that the experience is the gift.
Right.
That's never what I'm saying. When I'm saying that there's a gift in the challenge and purpose in the pain, what I'm saying is at some point later down the road, you're going to sit back and say, I would have never met this person unless, or I could have never realized this about myself unless, or this transformation would have never occurred unless. I'm not saying that you would want that transformation over having your loved one back. or that having this new person in your life that you met through this tragic experience, you would want over having lost the tragedy. That's never what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is certain things are going to come into your life that you could have never imagined that have been a benefit because of it. So one of the questions I had is, what and how did you become different that you would have never been able to get to had that experience not happened?
Such a great question. I love it. There is the first thing that comes to mind is like, it's freedom. I feel so free to do what I want, to be the way that I want to be. I think when you're with energy that is that down energy, and I'm not that person. I am definitely more of the up energy kind of a person. It really affects you, and I don't think you always realize how much it does until it's gone, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Was there a part of you at all when the marriage was happening that you were like, I'm missing my freedom? Like, did you even recognize that you didn't even have it?
Yes, to some degree I did. And I think I accepted it because I was like, okay, no one's perfect. You can't get 100% of your needs met from one person. And I'm going to accept who this person is. And there's also a lot of great things. So to some extent I did realize it. And I did question like, wow, it would be really nice to be with someone who's like a little bit more like happy-go-lucky or a little more positive.
Go with the
flow. And he was not. And I think in some senses, because we met when we were 21, we were babies. We did a lot of long distance. So we thought we were good. We thought, I did everything I wanted to do in my 20s except date other people. Dating is a whole nother topic, Stacey. We can totally go there. But my whole perspective actually on relationships had changed. Like I was in this, serious monogamous relationship from the time I was 21 till the time I was 34. Even if we weren't always living together during that time. And the last 3 years have been such a exploration for me, and you learn so much through being in relationship with other people. And not that it's all been fun. Dating is not always fun, but it does teach you a lot about yourself. And I feel like it's one of the many ways I've learned about myself over the last 3 years, in addition to having COVID, the pandemic, and really having to be with myself and spend. And actually, yes. I feel like I enjoy spending time with myself, and in a way that maybe I was always independent, but I feel like I now need that time for myself. Like I really like my alone time. I mean, I also like my balance. It's very important to me, but I feel like I learned how to develop a deeper relationship with myself, which was probably the number one thing that I learned is, and it sounds so cliche, but it's true, is the relationship that you need to cultivate most in life is a relationship with yourself. At the end of the day, that is who you have. That is. So
do you use that methodology and that ideology with your clients?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, I don't think I say it explicitly to them, but I think, yes, like that's what coaching is all about, is really developing that relationship with yourself so that you can move through those difficult emotions, so that you can be aware of how you're showing up, so that you can know how you want to show up and who you want to be in the future, right? If you don't develop that relationship with yourself, it's harder to get answers to those questions.
Now, how do people find you? How did these businesses find you?
Yeah, a lot of it is through relationship building, word of mouth. People that know me from my past life in some way, referrals. So I mean, there's a lot of coaches out there, and to know who you really jive with, right? Who really aligns with what you're looking for. I think people know, they get that gut feeling of what feels right to them. And there's that intuition.
And so are they organizations or individuals that reach out to you typically?
It's both. I'd say most of my practice tends to be individuals. I do also work with organizations as well. And I love working with both. I think there's so much impact to be made on all of those levels. And there's something really special about co-creating a space with people, and every individual, and every organization is different, right? There are themes that come up, but the unique people in the room create that space, right? So everyone has a piece of the pie in creating the culture, particularly the leadership.
So finish this sentence for me. People call Rachel Lipton when they need.
Yes, when they need to lead from a place of strength and confidence and find in their inner power.
So do they realize that they're not doing that before they call you?
It's a great question. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? Sometimes people they're not necessarily. Some people say, yeah, I want to be more confident, or I want to, I feel like I'm second guessing myself and my decision making.
Yeah.
Some people, come to me with, my team's great and I want to strengthen it even more. But then we look under the hood and then there's a lot of stuff going on. And so it's always peeling layers of an onion. So people don't always know what they need until they explore it.
But they know they need something.
What's that?
Right? I said, but they know they need
something. Yes. Yeah. They know they need something, like something isn't right. Like they're feeling dissatisfied. They're unfulfilled. They're feeling disempowered. Because of my experience, I love working with people who maybe have had a disempowering experience, either in their personal life or their professional life. And how do they step into their power as a person and a professional? And how do they lead from that place? That's a lot more exciting place to lead from, and a place of possibilities than coming from a place of disempowerment and deciding to stay there. So we always have the choice to stay there. Sometimes it takes distance and time, but we have a choice to stay there or not. And just like someone who's been through generational trauma, we also have the choice to act differently and break that cycle, right? And so that is the important piece. And so for people who are looking to do that, and particularly in a professional environment, those are the people that come to me.
So I want people to know how they can find you. Rachel, and all of this is going to be in the show notes, but Rachel has a website. It's her name, Rachel Lipton Coaching. And also, Rachel, do you still have this free offer where it's like an assessment to help uncover hidden super blockers and deeper dive into them?
I do. Yeah. I have like a really brief assessment on my website for people who want to see, what gets in their way and how. And then we do a debrief of it. And then you get a little taste of what that looks like and how you move through that and find what I like to call your superpowers within you.
I love it. Okay. And then if people are on social media, if they want to follow her on Instagram, it's rachel.lipton.coaching. You can find her on LinkedIn. She's also on Facebook. So all of that information will be in the show notes, so you guys can easily access that. One thing I know, and I end a lot of my podcasts this way, when I was in my breakdown, so let's just use this example of what you went through as like a massive breakdown to the breakthrough, right? When I went down through my most recent intense, I should say, breakdown was in around 2012. And I had no money and we were in a deep financial crisis. I didn't have money to go to the coaches I needed to go to get the support, mental health support I needed. Everything was a disaster money-wise. But I went to the library. I had never been to the library more. I started diving into any low and no cost resource I could. YouTube, podcasts, TED Talks, watching on Instagram, and whatever I could, I was consuming information that I was specifically looking for. And I ended up coming across 2 books that shifted everything for me in such a way that 25 years of therapy up to that point could not have given me. One was Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. And the other one was The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And I can honestly say, had I read those books 3-4 years prior, they would not have the same impact. The timing was right? I was at this tipping point. So 2 questions I have. One is, what's a book or any kind of resource, I should say, that you may have used to get through the relationship loss? And then the second part of that question is, what kind of resource, book, or any kind of tool like that do you ever recommend to your clients that are seeking the kind of help that you offer?
Great question. Well, to answer that latter one first, I really like the book Playing Big by Tara Moore. And I've trained with her and I love her work. I think it's very practical. And because I tend to work with a lot of women, not solely, but because I tend to work with a lot of women, it's specifically written for women to sort of quote unquote play bigger in their professional and personal lives. And it's a lot of coaching tools for yourself. Also works great in relationship with others. And so I love that book and I recommend that to many of my clients. In terms of what helped me, there were, it's so interesting because there were some books I don't think I could read for a while. Like I just couldn't process information for a while. But there is a book my aunt gave me, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's something around like how to survive the loss of a love. And it was really practical and kind of getting back to basics in terms of like finding that self-compassion within yourself as you're going through grief. And that's also what I work with clients a lot. When we realize what our inner critics are, those saboteurs, self-sabotaging ways of being are, also giving those pieces of ourselves some compassion can also be really helpful, because sometimes we push them away or say that they're bad or resist them, and they come up louder, right? If you're not giving them a chance to air out.
100%.
So I think that those self-compassion practices are beautiful. And there's a lot out there. I know Kristen Neff is also really big on self-compassion. She's a great resource as well. Tara Brach. So there's some really wonderful resources out there for people who are looking to be more self-compassionate in their life through whatever is going on. And that is self-compassion is such a beautiful and helpful tool.
And I'll piggyback on what you were just saying about parts. As a coach, I've dabbled enough in internal family systems and IFS by Dick Schwartz, where it's all what's called parts work. It's knowing that we all have these different parts that are made up, and some are louder than others, right? And it's our genuine self energy, as he would call it, or we can call it the authentic self, that ends up getting quieter and quieter as these other parts get louder and louder. He has a book, if people are interested in that concept, called No Bad Parts. And it's phenomenal. So, he says the same thing you just said, which is when you don't listen to the part, it's like a toddler. It just gets louder and louder and louder. And the best thing you can do is become inquisitive and curious and compassionate and dialogue with the part, which I actually do with people under hypnosis, which is amazing, to dialogue with these parts, to give them the voice that they really want to be heard and understood, because all these parts think that they're doing you a benefit. They all think that they're working in your favor. That's why they show up.
100%.
Which is a whole other podcast. So this has been amazing. The questions that you were able to answer were so insightful. I know for sure someone's going to listen to this and want to reach out, because what you have to offer is really, really valuable and so important.
Thank you, Stacey.
So again, if people want to reach out to Rachel, it's rachelliptoncoaching.com, and all the links, the information will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so eye-opening and such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Stacey. So appreciate the conversation, your questions, and just your being. So thank you so much. Really appreciated and enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much. And if you enjoyed this podcast, there are a lot of ways that you can get more information. You can follow the podcast. I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast. We're dropping a new show every single Monday. And you can do that just by really searching my name, Stacey Uhrig. It's Stacey with an E, and the last name is Uhrig. And if you want to know more about trauma, I actually have a new ebook that you can get right from my website, which is flipyourmindset.com, where you can download the new ebook, What is Trauma Really? Thanks so much for joining us, guys. Until next time.